All right. Get ready, because we're going to deep dive into a story that, you might not believe. What if I told you that Al Capone, public enemy number one, the guy who was all about bootlegging and violence during Prohibition, actually ran a soup kitchen?
Really? That's pretty surprising, right?
Yeah.
This is the man who built an empire on illegal liquor and gambling and, brutal gang wars. And yet here he is, offering free meals to thousands of people during, the Depression.
This wasn't just like a, small little thing. His soup kitchen, it was actually this well-run operation right there on South State Street in Chicago. They had this huge banner that said, "Free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed."
Oh, wow. I can only imagine what that scene must have been like.
Yeah.
Like, picture it, 1930, Chicago.
Yeah.
Just reeling through the Depression. Streets are just filled with, these desperate families who have lost everything. Unemployment is just soaring. And people are just lining up for blocks just to get some food. And then right into this, super bleak landscape walks Al Capone, a man who made, a fortune exploiting the very system that now seems to be failing so many.
Yeah, and, his soup kitchen actually had a surprisingly generous menu, like coffee and sweet rolls for breakfast, soup and bread for lunch and dinner, no questions asked, no proof of need, just a warm meal.
Wow.
Yeah, it's almost like something out of a movie, this notorious gangster offering this lifeline to, people who are struggling. Makes you wonder what was he really up to?
That is the big question, right? Was he actually compassionate for the people in his community? Or was this just a PR stunt to make himself look better?
No.
Or maybe it was even, a way to kind of gain favor with the authorities.
Right, because we know Capone was a businessman, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like his illegal gambling, those dens alone were bringing in what, like $25,000 a month? Imagine that. That's wild. The average worker back then, I was probably struggling to make a few dollars a week, and his pockets are just overflowing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the soup kitchen itself, it didn't even cost him that much to run, like around $300 a day.
Really?
Yeah. That's nothing compared to what he was making.
Mm-hmm.
So, from a financial standpoint, this was a pretty small investment for him.
Yeah.
But the potential rewards in terms of how the public saw him, huge.
It's almost like he knew he was public enemy number one, so maybe he was trying to soften his image a little bit.
Oh, maybe, yeah.
Maybe shift public opinion.
Right.
Because he had a reputation to maintain.
Yeah, definitely. There's actually this really interesting anecdote about a Thanksgiving turkey heist that year. 1,000 turkeys were stolen, right before Thanksgiving. And Capone was really worried that he was going to be blamed, even though he had nothing to do with it. So he quickly changed the soup kitchen menu to beef stew that day.
That's kind of funny. Talk about being like caught in the crosshairs of your own reputation.
Right.
But it just goes to show that, everything he did, people were watching.
Oh, for sure.
He knew it.
He knew how the public would see it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. His image was just always in the public eye.
Right.
So it, begs the question, how did people actually see him?
Yeah.
Was he a hero? Was he a villain?
Yeah, a savior or like a manipulator?
Who knows?
Right.
Right.
To really understand that, though, I think we need to think about the context, right?
Yeah, good point.
The Great Depression, that had just shaken America to its core. The government's response, most people thought it was pretty inadequate.
Totally.
It left a lot of people feeling abandoned.
Yeah, for sure.
Forgotten.
Absolutely.
And then you have Al Capone stepping into this, this void. A man who, despite, all of his criminal activity, he understood, the struggles of the working class.
He did, yeah.
He grew up in a poor family himself.
He did. He knew what it was like to be hungry.
Yeah.
To not have a safety net.
So, it makes sense why some people might have seen him as kind of a Robin Hood figure.
Yeah. A guy who's willing to, do what the government wouldn't.
Right, provide for the people.
Exactly.
But we also have to remember that not everyone was buying into this whole, charity act.
Yeah, totally. A lot of people were very critical, and I can't blame them.
Yeah.
It's pretty easy to see his, philanthropy as just a calculated tactic.
Right, to just cover up his crimes.
Exactly. Gain public acceptance,
Right, yeah, it's a really complex situation. We're talking about a guy who was, full of contradictions.
Oh, absolutely.
So how did the public react?
Yeah, how did people actually feel about this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, were they swayed by the fact that he was being generous?
Right.
Or, did his reputation precede him?
Yeah, I mean, let's take a look at what some of the newspapers said at the time. Like, for example, the Bismarck Tribune. They wrote, "A hungry man is just as glad to get soup and coffee from Al Capone as from anyone else."
It's like they weren't necessarily praising him, but they understood how desperate people were. They didn't care where the food was coming from as long as they got to eat.
Right. And then you have Mary Borden. She wrote in Harper's Magazine, and she called Capone, get this, an ambidextrous giant who kills with one hand and feeds with the other.
Whoa.
What an image, right?
That's powerful.
Yeah.
It really captures, like, that whole moral, ambiguity of the situation.
Absolutely. And she even pointed out that the line for his soup kitchen often stretched right past the door of Chicago's police headquarters, the very place that held the evidence of his crimes.
Oh, the irony.
I know, right?
But I guess, even with the soup kitchen, not everyone was fooled.
No, not at all. Like the Daily Independent, they called it the farce of gangland.
Mm-hmm.
They were even worried that Capone might use his, newfound popularity to run for mayor.
Mayor Capone. I mean, even with the soup kitchen, he just couldn't shake that reputation.
Yeah. And in the end, his good deeds, they couldn't erase his past.
Yeah.
But it does raise this really big question. Can good deeds really redeem a person who has a history of violence and crime?
That's a question that, continues to intrigue people, and it's definitely something we'll keep exploring in our deep dive today. But now let's take a closer look at the impact that Capone Soup Kitchen had on the people who relied on it.
It's just crazy to think about all those people. I mean, lining up for a meal at Capone's Soup Kitchen. What do you think that must have been like for them?
Oh, man. Like, on the one hand, you've got these people. I mean, they're desperate for a hot meal, right?
Yeah.
That's the ultimate symbol of how bad the economy was. And on the other hand, the guy giving them the food, it's a gangster. Like someone they might be afraid of.
Totally. Or even, hated him.
Yeah.
But I guess they were just, they were united by their need, right?
Yeah.
Like, it just goes to show how desperate things were. That they would take help from, someone like Capone. Someone who's, let's face it, his wealth came from illegal stuff.
Right. It makes you think about, like, charity in general. Does it matter where the money comes from if it's going to a good cause?
Right. I mean, like, can you really, cleanse dirty money through philanthropy?
Yeah.
And it's something we still talk about today, right?
Yeah.
Like when you think about all those super rich people and their charities. But back then with Capone, it was, talk about a thorny issue.
Yeah.
The guy he was a walking contradiction of the Roaring '20s and then, the depression that came after.
Right. Like he was the poster boy for excess.
Oh, yeah.
Speakeasies and all that. But then at the same time, he's the one, providing this vital service to people who were barely getting by.
I wonder how the people getting those meals, like how they saw those two sides of him.
Yeah.
Did they see him as like a savior, or did they think he was just trying to, pull a fast one on them?
Yeah. So, like, what about the long-term impact of all of this? Did other people start doing the same thing? Did it change how people thought about gangsters or, like, private charity in general?
That's a really good question. But to be honest, we don't have a ton of information about the long-term effects of Capone's Soup Kitchen. We know it was around for a while, a few years, I think, fed a lot of people. But the main thing it left us with, I think, is more questions than answers.
Right. Maybe that's the biggest part of this story. It's not so much about Capone himself, but like the moral questions he makes us ask. Like, what's good and evil? Can people change? What makes people do the things they do?
Yeah, exactly. It makes you think about all those like gray areas, where right and wrong get all blurry.
Yeah. And Capone wasn't the only one who was, not exactly a saint back then. Like, think about prohibition itself.
Oh, man, talk about hypocrisy.
Like, the government tries to ban alcohol thinking it's going to make everyone more moral.
Right.
What happens? It creates this whole black market. It made guys like Capone rich.
Totally.
And even the people who weren't, criminals, they were still, like, sneaking into speakeasies, drinking bootleg liquor. It's like everyone was in on it, even though they knew it was wrong.
Yeah, it's wild. So I guess in a way, Capone's Soup Kitchen is like this little snapshot of, how messed up society was back then, all these contradictions.
Exactly. Like, you have the government making these laws with, good intentions, but it just blows up in their face. Then you have the lure of all this easy money and, people being people, capable of good things, and then doing terrible stuff too.
Oh, and it's it reminds you that, like, history isn't just about heroes and villains. It's messy. You have all these competing things going on.
Yeah.
Moral compromises. People doing kind things when you least expect it.
It seems like, the more we look into this story, the more questions we end up with. So did his soup kitchen, actually help his community in the end? Did it change people's minds about him?
Yeah.
And, the big question, can someone with a past like his, can they really be redeemed by doing good things?
It's something historians still debate today. And honestly, I think that's why we're so drawn to this story. It doesn't have easy answers. But it makes us think about human nature, what it means to be good when, the world around you isn't.
It definitely makes you think. It's one of those stories that just sticks with you.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the power of history, right? Like, we get to step outside of our own time, see things from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And we end up, questioning our own beliefs about things.
I know I have a lot to think about after this deep dive.
Me too. It's a good reminder that the best stories, the ones that are really fascinating, are the ones that don't fit into those neat little boxes of right and wrong.
Yeah, and that even the worst people, they can still surprise you.
Right.
They can still do something good, even if it seems, kind of complicated. We've spent all this time looking at Al Capone's story, right? Like, from when he was this, ruthless gangster in Chicago to when he, was doing that whole soup kitchen thing during the Depression.
Yeah, like, it's been, kind of a wild ride looking at all the contradictions, the crazy times he was living in. And the guy he really made people think, about what was right and wrong.
And I gotta say, I'm still, a little uneasy.
Right.
How do you deal with the fact that Capone was this gangster who, caused so much pain and then, turned around and helped so many people?
That's like the big question, isn't it? Like, how do we understand good and evil? Can you separate what someone does from who they are?
Right.
And can good deeds really make up for a bad past?
Yeah, it'd be so much easier if we could just say, okay, this person's a hero, this person's a villain, end of story.
Right.
But Capone, he doesn't fit into those, neat categories. And honestly, I think history's kind of like that in general.
Yeah, for sure. People are complicated, right? They can be so kind and then, turn around and do awful things. And sometimes, it's the same person doing both.
So, where does that leave us with Capone? How do we even begin to, understand a guy like that?
I think it just shows us that we got to look deeper, people are more than just their actions. It's like, even in the darkest times, even the worst people, there's still that little spark of humanity in there somewhere.
Yeah. And it makes you think about our own, hypocrisy too. We judge Capone, right? But how many of us are part of systems that hurt other people?
Right.
Or, take advantage of others in some way? It's an uncomfortable question, but it's something to think about.
It is, for sure. And it's like, in a weird way, Capone's story is almost like a mirror,
Yeah.
showing us all the messed up stuff in our own society.
It's like a reminder that we can't just look back at history and think we have all the answers or know exactly what's right and wrong. History's messy. It's complicated.
Totally. We have to embrace the messiness of it all, see all those shades of gray.
And maybe, if we do that, we can start to challenge our own beliefs and biases, maybe even learn something about ourselves in the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we, wrap up our deep dive into Capone's soup kitchen, I'm still left with a ton of questions. But honestly, I think that's a good thing. It means it's a story worth thinking about, one that sticks with you.
It definitely is. And, I hope this deep dive makes everyone want to learn more about this time in history. It's pretty fascinating.
And I hope it gets everyone, thinking about good and evil and, people can really change and all those really big questions about what it means to be human.
Yeah, exactly. Because in the end, that's what history's all about.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.